All right. I had to take off today, stay home with my daughter, so I'm going to be doing some video notes for you today, so you don't get left behind in the where we are in the stuff. So anyway, we're picking up today from Social Security Act. I think everybody yesterday finished what Social Security Act was, so we're resuming with the 1936 election. So since the economy was improving by 1936, FDR and the New Deal was very popular. FDR is going to win in a landslide in 36 as well. Again, the economy is not fixed. It's still getting better, but it still has a lot of work to do. The president was now enormously popular with all the workers and farmers of the United States. Businesses didn't like him as much because of all the regulation acts he passed, like the Wagner Act and those kind of things. But he's very popular, as you can see from the chart. He wins all but 2 states in the Electoral College. The guy that the Republicans ran was a governor from Kansas named Alf Landon. And basically all he did was criticize the Democrats for spending too much, but accepted many of the New Deal programs. So his campaign wasn't much of anything. So Democrats and Roosevelt will win overwhelmingly again in 1936, which is a mandate to continue the New Deal even more. Probably the biggest result, though, from this is that it creates what's called a New Deal coalition. This has long-term implications for national politics. For the past several decades, Republicans have pretty much been the most dominant party in national politics. Well, this is when the switch finally happens. So since basically Reconstruction, Republicans have pretty much been the dominant party in U.S. National politics. And now, from 1930s with FDR until the 1960s, you're going to see the Democrats become more of the dominant party because of the coalition FDR creates. And it's a very delicate coalition because there's some groups in there that don't always see eye to eye. So the people who make up the New Deal coalition are like the Solid South, because they still vote Democrat, white ethnic groups in cities, so immigrant family types or people who are descendants from immigrants, Midwestern farmers, and labor unions, people who work in factories, those kind of people. Also African Americans. This is where African Americans begin to switch over from the Republican Party. They voted Republican since Reconstruction, with the being the party of Lincoln helped free the slaves. And now, as in the 1930s, you begin to see the shift where African Americans begin to vote for Democrats more because of the types of programs they're offering, assistance programs and so forth. So this is going to form the new Democrat coalition, or the New Deal coalition, that's going to last and have let them retain lots of influence and power for the next 30 years or so. White ethnic groups, Solid South, Midwestern farmers, labor unions, and African Americans. Okay. So we're now looking at the critics of the New Deal, people who had issues with the New Deal in general. You're going to have both liberal and conservative critics of the New Deal. Liberal critics. So obviously FDR, and he's pushing the Democratic Party to be more liberal anyway. So FDR is making the party itself more liberal, but there are even more extreme liberals who are dissatisfied with the way that the party's gone. So there are some extreme liberals and socialists that thought the New Deal didn't do enough, that it helped business too much and not helped out the workers and average Americans enough. So the extreme liberals wanted more New Deal programs to be specifically helping unemployed and the poor and not helping businesses so much. They felt like the New Deal could do more to address minorities, could address women, could address the elderly. And just overall, it's like I said, it's kind of like borderline socialism. They basically want the government to maybe take over like businesses and stuff and help push more equality, but it never gets to that point. But that's so there are liberal critics of FDR, but that's of the two sides, liberal versus conservative. It's obviously probably that liberals are probably the smaller side. The bigger critical side is the conservative side. Way more on the conservative right that criticize FDR. The conservatives thought the New Deal gave federal government too much power. Obviously, nothing like this has ever been happened before. The government's never gotten this big before, so it's a scary to a lot of folks. Businesses were alarmed by things like the WPA created, the Wagner Act, or like TVA, where the government's directly competing with private business. So those kind of things they criticize as being borderline socialism, borderline communism. Businesses were alarmed by 1, increased regulation. 2, the Second New Deal's very pro-union stance with like the Wagner Act and taking away some power of the businesses. And 3, financing government programs with borrowed money with massive deficit spending. We haven't really talked about that in detail yet, but there was massive deficit spending during the New Deal because the idea was the government had to spend money and spend into debt to basically cover all these programs. But the idea is once the economy got going again, then things would be okay and you could turn off the deficit spending down the road. So that's, again, businesses were alarmed by 1, increased regulation, 2, the Second New Deal's pro-union stance, and 3, financing the government's programs with borrowed money or deficit spending. Conservative Democrats even joined with Republicans in opposing the way that the party was going. So there are conservative Democrats who also don't like what's happening to their party. The biggest example of that is Al Smith. Al Smith ran as a Democrat against Herbert Hoover in 1928, and he's one of the guys who becomes vocally opposed to the things that FDR is doing and what the party's becoming. But these 3 guys right here are the ones you need to be aware of the most. They call them demagogues. These 3 men right here, these are by far the most vocal critics to FDR's programs. The first of which is Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin is a Catholic priest who had a radio show in the Midwest, somewhere like, I want to say like Detroit or something, Detroit or Chicago, somewhere in there. So Father Coughlin, because he had this radio show, it was very popular. He reached tens of thousands of people in his radio broadcast. But at first he supported the New Deal. Over time, he felt like he didn't do enough, essentially. All 3 of these guys, that's kind of their story. They felt like the New Deal didn't do enough. Coughlin founded the National Union for Social Justice. So Coughlin was the founder of this organization called the National Union for Social Justice, which called for issuing inflated currency and nationalizing all banks. So he wanted to issue more inflated currency, basically where money was not backed on gold or silver or anything. And he also wanted to nationalize all banks, basically meaning that he wanted the government to take over banks, period. He also talked about nationalizing industry as well, too, which this is obviously borderline, or it basically is socialism in general. There's my wake-up alarm. Over time, so he got a lot of popularity because he had such a wide audience, but over time he became not so popular because he started having some anti-Semitic things he would say on the radio. People also thought he might be fascist, which obviously with this happening he was kind of supportive of some of the things that Germany was doing inside of Europe at the time, in the 1930s, and so over time he lost a lot of popularity because he was taking these pro-fascist, or anti-Semitic stances, I should say. So his superiors eventually ordered him to stop, and he lost his radio show. The second guy who opposed FDR very vocally was Dr. Francis Townsend. Dr. Francis Townsend was a doctor in California, a physician, who criticized the New Deal early on, like in the first year or 2, saying there should be some kind of guaranteed income for retirees. So basically, Townsend is one of the guys who criticizes the New Deal for not doing enough for retirees or elderly before Social Security. Like his idea basically leads to Social Security. Townsend believed that 60-year-olds and older should receive about $200 a month from tax money, which basically becomes it basically becomes Social Security. So he wanted retirees, 60-year-olds and higher, to receive $200 a month from the government in tax money. He said that spending would also improve the economy once they had money from the government, and also, of course, would open up jobs for people who needed them. So obviously Townsend had some influence over FDR because in the Second New Deal in 1935, he's influenced to go ahead and make the Social Security Act, which basically creates that program. But the guy who was the biggest threat to FDR and the biggest critic was Huey Long. Huey Long had been governor of Louisiana, and by the time FDR takes office as president, he's now Senator Huey Long. Huey Long had done some socialist-type stuff for Louisiana, and he was basically supporting that at the national level once he became senator in 1933. So Long had a program called Share Our Wealth. Long has a program called Share Our Wealth, where he promised a guaranteed income of about $5,000 annually to families and taxing the wealthy heavily. So again, this is pretty much straight up socialism, where he wanted wealthy earners to have a cap to earnings, basically around $5-6 million, and whatever money they made beyond $5-6 million a year, he would give to the poor, which that would help create the $5,000 annually for the low-income folks. So he wanted every family to have at least $5,000 of income every year to at least have money or something. So, but you would pay for that by heavily taxing the rich. And so Long is going around promoting the Share Our Wealth program, and he's talking about this in Congress. He's talking about he's a very boisterous person, has a lot of influence. If you ever see him talk, he was very charismatic. One of the reasons why he became governor and senator from our state. And the biggest reason why he's a threat, because he could run against FDR for president. So in 35, there was talk that Long would run for president against FDR in 36. And so if that happened, you'd basically have another situation where you would split the party, right? You'd have Long and you'd have FDR running for a Democratic nomination, and then whatever Republican was running would probably win because the ticket would be split. And that was kind of Long's plan. Long's plan was to kind of make FDR get the boot, and then you have 4 terrible years under a Republican, and Long could come back later on in 1940. But of course that doesn't happen, because in 1935 he gets assassinated. So let the conspiracy mill begin. Was it FDR involved? We'll never know, right? Did he have Huey Long killed so that way he could ensure that he would win the presidency? We don't know. Just have to think about it. But Huey Long does die, and that removes the biggest threat politically to FDR after that point. Okay. Stop the first video there, and I'll pick up the next video after that.